Hello, class. Hey, I'm back, and I'm no longer in my storage closet. Yes, another room opened up. So I am in a room alone again. So, room of one's own, carrying on that theme, so that we can be productive and discuss Mary Wollstonecraft. And the excerpt of hers that we read this week is from A Vindication of the Rights of Woman. So, pretty cool. Yeah, it's another great work. Very exciting to read. So, in the lecture, we have several web links that you could take a look at if you would like to know more about Mary Shelley's life or her works. She's a really intriguing woman, and she's actually mother of another woman that we will read later on in class, Mary Shelley, who wrote, you may know her from Frankenstein. Yeah. So anyway, here are some web links. There's the plato.stanford.edu website with information on Wollstonecraft as a philosopher and writer. A biography.com biography of Wollstonecraft, and onlineliterature.com, which has some of her other works talked about as well as her life. So. Oh, and there's a YouTube video that animates a figure of Mary Wollstonecraft herself to narrate a first person account of her life and beliefs. So that's a little fun. Yeah. So you might want to check that out, right? All right. Mary Wollstonecraft lived from 1759 to 1797. Sadly, another one who died what we consider to be at a young age, 38 years old, not very old at all. And it was sadly and tragically 11 days after she gave birth to her very famous daughter that I told you about that we're going to read, Mary Wollstonecraft Godwin Shelley. Yes, that's a big name, Mary Wollstonecraft Godwin Shelley. Now, most people know her as just Mary Shelley. They leave out the two names in the middle. Anyway, she married the famous poet Percy Bysshe Shelley. Yeah, he's a very famous poet in his own right. And that's where she got the Shelley part of her name. And then she herself, as I mentioned, wrote Frankenstein, which is considered to be, by many, the very first science fiction novel. So kind of cool. And that's like, since she gave birth to her in 1797, and I think Mary Shelley wrote that novel when she was very young, like maybe 19 or something, but we'll talk about that later when we get to her. So it's really early on in the 1800s that we have our first piece of science fiction English writing. Anyway, but enough about Mary Shelley. Let's go on to Mary Wollstonecraft, her mother. So Mary, the mother, died from septicemia from the birth of her daughter. Mary Wollstonecraft grew up with an abusive father and a submissive mother. Her father squandered his inheritance on failed farming ventures. Mary would sleep on the landing outside her mother's room to protect her mother from her father's physical abuse. So quite a traumatic childhood. Mary educated herself, though, despite her family's poverty and instability. And at 19, she left home to escape the family life that had oppressed her. She worked as a tutor and a seamstress and a companion. So what's a companion? That sounds weird, right? Well, a companion is someone who provides somebody who doesn't have someone to be with all the time, like a friend or a family member. Usually it's like somebody, an older person whose family has either died or moved away and maybe can't quite do everything on her own. And so she needs another female companion to like go on walks with or to talk with or to help her with maybe just some basic tasks in the house. That's usually what a companion would do. So Mary rescued her sister Elizabeth from a nervous breakdown and an intolerable marriage, though the child Elizabeth left behind soon thereafter died. So, she left her home to escape the tragedy and then goes from one tragedy to another where her sister is in a bad marriage just as well, kind of like her mother, and has a nervous breakdown. And so Mary helps rescue her, but they leave her child behind and the child dies. So, it just seems like tragedy upon tragedy here with his family. And it doesn't end there. It continues on through Mary Shelley's life, too. Yeah, sad to say. But we'll get to that. Maybe next week. We'll see when we talk about her. As does her A Vindication of the Rights of Women, written in 1792. Mary's writings sympathized with the sufferings and victimizations of women. Of course, after her experience with her mother and her sister, and the father that victimized her mom and the husband that victimized her sister. And she argued for the education of women, which was not widely available to women at the time. We talked about like some female academies starting to spring up, but again, it wasn't really focusing on academics. They were focusing more on manners and maybe talents, sewing and singing and playing instruments and just the things that you can do to entertain and manage a house. Pretty much. So A Vindication of the Rights of Woman followed Wollstonecraft's previous retaliation, A Vindication of the Rights of Men, written in 1790, which itself was a retaliation to Edmund Burke's Reflections on the Revolution in France. So Edmund Burke wrote Reflections on the Revolution in France, and he kind of supported more of the elitist points of view there. And Mary Wollstonecraft rebutted that with her A Vindication of the Rights of Man, in which she analyzed the exploitation of the working class and so argued for the rights of common people. And then she wrote, after that, A Vindication of the Rights of women. So men is plural and then woman is singular. So anyway, but I think that put ideas in her head, like not only are these working class people being exploited, but women in general are being exploited. So now I need to write a follow-up pamphlet about how we need to stand up for the rights of women and the education of women and the victimization of them. So Wollstonecraft's actual personal life, though, was often at odds with the theories she espoused, interestingly. First, she fell in love with a married man. So not really supporting the rights of that woman, right? Kind of creating an intolerable marriage there. But that's what happened. She then loved an American, Gilbert Imlay, with whom she actually had a child named Fanny. He abandoned Mary with their baby Fanny while they were in France during the country's brutal reign of terror. Okay, so Edmund Burke wrote about the reflections on the revolution in France. So there was this revolution that happened, and then during that revolution is this reign of terror where there's like absolute, they killed the French people, stormed the Bastille, got the weapons, went and kidnapped the monarchy's family, and then, well, they just got basically the king and queen, King Louis XVI and Queen Marie Antoinette, and imprisoned them and eventually beheaded them. And then I want to say all hell broke loose because everybody started getting beheaded. Robespierre led this reign of terror where it's, started with beheading, because they had just invented the guillotine as the quick and easy way to punish people by death. And it got used left and right in the reign of terror. People were getting guillotined. Like, first it started with certain people, like, oh, you support the monarchy. And no, we don't want the monarchy because we believe that everybody is equal. They kind of got, they took a lot of inspiration from our American Revolution, where we threw out our monarchy and rebelled and formed our own country, right? Well, they wanted to do the same. They wanted to get rid of their monarchy and form a government where it was just ruled by the people. But for whatever reason, it wasn't as organized. I guess like it spun out of control, and people just, like, the people that had started the revolution started guillotining the people that were supporting the monarchy. And then it just like went from one to the, it was almost like the Red Scare, during the 1950s in America, where you're like, oh, this person's coming, that person's coming. It's like you started turning everybody in and you didn't even know who was who anymore. And it just like spun out of control. So it was that kind of paranoia, I think, that took over in the Reign of Terror. And they just started guillotining people. And then they started guillotining people that were on their side. And I mean, at the end of the day, a lot of people died and there was a lot of chaos. And finally, the country needed to, it finally took another very strong dictatorial leader, in a sense, to take control of France again and pull things back together, and that was Napoleon. And unfortunately, because they were in such a state of chaos, they were susceptible to an emperor, a strong man, essentially, who could strong arm the country back into order. So then that was another can of worms there. So anyway, during this reign of terror, the father of her baby, just abandoned them, in this very scary and brutal time in France's history. So she wrote a history about what the times were like in France then. That's what she did. She took her lemons and made lemonade out of them. Gilbert was also unfaithful to her, though Mary never claimed the privilege of marriage, in spite of her being registered as Gilbert's wife for the protection of his American citizenship in France. Upon discovery of Gilbert's infidelity, she actually tried to commit suicide. Mary did. Mary later fell in love with William Godwin. They both rejected the institution of marriage because at the time it endowed men with rights but removed them from women. So men got more rights when they got married and women got fewer. But when Mary became pregnant with his daughter, who later would become Mary Shelley, Mary Wollstonecraft Godwin Shelley, that's where we get the last name of Godwin. It's from her father, and Wollstonecraft, of course, from her mother, and then Shelley eventually from her husband. Anyway, so when Mary became pregnant with his daughter, Mary, or her daughter, both of their daughter, the two decided to get married, but live in separate apartments so that they could concentrate on their writing. Isn't that interesting? And who would have thought that happened so long ago? Yeah, so very long ago. We're talking, this was not even the 1800s yet. This is 1796 maybe when she got pregnant with Mary, and they rejected the custom of marriage, which, was unheard of in the day. I mean, to be, to live as man and woman and not be married would have been very scandalous at the time and very opposed to, the religion that governed England. And yet the two of them rejected marriage, and she had already had a child out of wedlock from Gilbert Imlay, who ended up leaving her. And prior to that, she had a relationship with a married man. So lots of what would have been considered very scandalous behavior at the time. Also very, I guess, very defiant of social custom too. Which is maybe what enabled her to write what she did, because she was able to consider it from a unique perspective outside of social norm, and to write in favor of the rights of women, in marriage, in singledom, in society, period, and argue for the education of women too, and their rights. So interestingly, she finally did marry William Godwin, and I think that was because she was pregnant and she wanted her daughter to maybe enjoy the rights of having a father who's married to the mother, because those rights weren't protected by the law, unless you actually had a father married to your mother. Like otherwise, it was a pretty hard state, I think, for children born out of wedlock at that time. So they got married, so that they were married by the time the daughter was born. And but it's very interesting. They decided to live in different apartments so that they could concentrate on their work, their life's work. They were both writers. So that goes back to that room of one's own, right? That Virginia Woolf talked about. You need to be able to concentrate and focus to be able to write. So, yeah, remember that when you're writing your own stuff too. When you're writing papers and things and doing homework, you need that space